One of the projects we are currently involved in is the study of a pair of stays found in the National Museums of Scotland collection. This project's been funded by the Society of Antiquaries of London, and we've had the stays X-rayed to see what is going on beneath.
The reason being is that the centre front of the stays is hugely curvaceous. It's been very manipulated, very sort of firmly created to create a very 3D, very distinct shaping to it.
This project has been designed to better understand that shaping, both the hows and the whys behind it. And the image on the screen, which you can see now, this is the original pair of stays from the National Museums of Scotland.
We've been boning these stays now for a couple of weeks. This is all hand-stitched boning channels. So we've done now all the panels. And the next stage is to wrap the seam allowance in. So just the sides, and we're just folding the fabric seam allowance in as neatly as possible and whip stitching it down. You can see that I'm using a linen thread here. Quite a lot of garments in the 18th century seem to use linen thread for either slightly less important jobs that take perhaps less strain, and in the case of this pair of stays, this is an unseen area. It's going to be hidden by the lining at a later stage, so it's not ever really going to come to light. So the linen thread was probably much cheaper than the silk threads in the 18th century, so they would have used the cheaper thread where they could get away with it. And you can see this kind of method on stays such as SNO 1293 that's in the National Trust collection. They are handily unlined, so you get sort of full easy access to all of the inner workings that have gone on. As I work my way down the seam, I just want to make sure that I don't pull too tightly. I've learnt this the hard way. If you pull too tightly, you actually create a slight ridge where the threads are tucking in the seam allowance. The originals, when you see them, this stitch just looks so simple, so neat, so like naturally sewn almost, but it's not until you come to redo it, to recreate it, that you realise just how much skill these people must have had, that they just make everything look natural and easy. I've learnt, for example, to trim back the seam allowance of the lining section that's the backing for the bones, because on the originals you can just see the neat line of one layer of fabric. You don't get all these layers, whereas before, when I was leaving the seam allowance long and folding it like that, you can see the double layer. Just little things like this. Their stitching is incredibly regular. You can see mine is a little bit, because I want to try and catch the flat of the bone. I sometimes have wider stitches, irregular. It's not as neat as the original. So I think when you first see this stitch, you think, oh yes, that's what they've done. They folded in the seam allowance and they've whip stitched it down. Brilliant. And then when you come to redo it, you actually realise just even that they have done this seam so many times that it has become well practiced and second nature to them, that they just do it incredibly neatly. So even the inside basic stitch is a challenge for me to get looking as good as the original. And I'm just going to work my way through the rest of these panels. This is today's job, is just to fold in this seam allowance and get it ready and get it ready for when the panels all join together. So the next panel to this will come and sit right on that folded edge, and they'll get whip stitched together like so. Stays were what women wore in the 18th century, partly to create that fashionable silhouette that we see in the portraits and paintings. Stays kind of create a very rigid cone around the bust and waist area, so you're not accentuating any of the curves in that area. You're actually smoothing them down into a very sort of firm torso. If you want to sit down and have a good read about stays and stay making, I cannot suggest to you Patterns of Fashion 5 heavily enough. Like, it is such an extraordinarily good book. The School of Historic Dress, who have published it, they've really unearthed some tailors' sort of notebooks, stay makers, journals, stuff like that. So they have brought together a really amazing source of information that I think would have been quite hard to each of us to have found for ourselves. You know, to have somebody go out and bring it all together and collate it has just been incredibly useful. From their research, they've kind of developed a comprehension of how stays might have been drafted. I don't know if you've heard of the arc method. It is something that has come out from Patterns of Fashion 5, and the research behind it is that a lot of the stays, drawings and not engravings, but sort of etchings that they find in notebooks and journals, even in the layout in Garceult's L'Art d'Atelier, it sort of suggests that the actual drafting method was done in a very similar layout to the ways that the drawings are done, and that rather than in modern day pattern cutting you have a straight waistline and a straight bust line, but actually they create this arc so that the bust lines and the waistlines are curved, and you pattern draft the stays around that curve. The stays that we're working on here, these haven't been drafted by me. These are a pattern I've taken from the originals in the study session, so hopefully as accurately to the original shaping as possible. The idea being is that if you can replicate the original pattern cutted shapes, you can really build an idea of what those shapings, what that drafting was doing. You just try and mimic it, but create it for a different shape. You might lose some of the stuff you can learn about it. So these are going to be made to as best as I possibly can to the original shaping, technique, sizing as possible. So though my research is nowhere near as deep as the School of Historic Dresses, I have studied, I think stays are fascinating. So I've studied sort of over 20 pairs now from sort of various museums. And this is probably like the 15th pair I think I've made. Like, I started off and some of them were terrible. I think when you see the originals and you can just see how flat they've got their boning, how smooth, how, like, some of them, especially the fully boned pairs, they literally feel like kind of light wood just covered over with fabric. Like, they are so densely compacted, but they don't feel, they are heavy and they are bulky, but they don't feel heavy and bulky. You just, you feel it, you just think, oh, it kind of melts my brain a bit as to how densely they've packed in their whalebone, and how the kind of the effect they've created. So the journey of trying to understand the methods, trying to figure out how they've created what they've created, every single pair of stays, I think, no, I need to try this method, or let's try this. You know, there's something else I need to learn or tweak or change. And like I say, even getting the seam allowance wrapped in neatly is a challenge for me. I cannot get it as neat as theirs. So just things like that, really. And once these seams are wrapped, the next job will be to join all the panels together. And then that's when the kind of complex stuff really starts kicking in, because that's when we'll be looking at the things that the X-rays have shown, boning, all that kind of inner manipulation work. I'll need to get my head around. The other section that I'm really not sure about at the moment is the side tabs. These ones here, they're not just bound with leather, they're lined with leather. So the leather sits at the back and then folds around to the top, and it's quite crudely whip stitched. Actually, you can really see the stitching, but I think that's because they need to catch as much of the leather so it doesn't tear the leather. So I've not tried that method before. That's going to be an interesting one. This project has to be completed by December. That's the deadline. It should be culminating in a paper for those of you that are interested.